Very much for showing up and coming and listening. So my name is Håkan Johansson. So I'm a professor in social work, Lund University, Sweden. So I've various research interests, quite a lot kind of connecting to civil society studies and civil society and welfare state developments for, well, addressing issues about contracts and advocacy and lobbying and many other things. But for the last years, I've been more and mostly working with this topic of civil society elites, which I'm going to address here today. And it's a major research project. So we've been scholars from political science, sociology, and social work with a kind of a common interest into civil society and also into patterns of inequality and power, and using this concept of civil society elites to address kind of resource concentration within the sector or sphere of civil society. So I'm going to spend kind of 20-25 minutes to very briefly address what's the project about, our key results, and of course also some points for discussion and debate towards the end of this presentation and so on. So I will start sharing my slide in short. Can you see it? Is it working? Yeah. So the title of this presentation is Civil Society Elites in Europe. And I think it's easy. And of course, this concept of civil society elites is quite intriguing. So what do we mean by it? Why combining civil society and elites? I mean, it appears quite paradoxical in a way. They do not really fit together. I mean, civil society to quite a large extent. I mean, there is so many books about how to conceptualize civil society, what's civil society about, and what's civil society not about. I think the image we have in front of us is at least kind of putting us to the core understanding, or one core understanding of what civil society is about. It's about citizens. It's about citizens coming together. It's about citizens coming together in an ambition to express themselves, and often in an ambition to express themselves in connection to, or perhaps even in contrast or conflict or in opposition to, those who have power in society. So civil society as kind of the sphere where citizens mobilize and of course organize themselves. The idea and ideal of grassroots mobilization, of social movements, of bottom-up organizing, that's kind of forming civil society much more as a counter power against other forms of power in society. So it's not about the business elites, it's not about the political elites. It's about this idea of civil society as acting against them, actually. And I think if we read through books and articles and theories and theorizing about civil society, this kind of message about civil society is very strong. However, at the same time, we find loads of, let's say, studies and also theorizing about civil society largely in connection with this image. The idea of civil society is highly professionalized. It's organized, it's institutionalized. We use these terms of NGOization, kind of addressing this, that when we start to organize things, they tend to lead into hierarchies. And organizations tend to be led by leaders. And some of these leaders are, well, quite powerful because the organizations are quite powerful. It's the big organizations, it's major civil society organizations. And this image here, we have a man and a woman representing civil society as such at the kind of a UN negotiation table. So in the row beneath them, there is the countries. And of course, here we have the representatives of civil society. This is also kind of a proper conceptualization of how civil society is organized. So together with colleagues, we started to think about, okay, they do not really fit together. And people have quite a lot studied the organizations and the movements, but not so much studied the leaders of these major organizations, and even less thought about leaders as elites, or potentially using elite theories and elite methods to address civil society leaders as a potential elite along other elite groups in society. So we did, as we academics usually do, we write our proposals, and were lucky to get a really big sack of money from a Swedish research council to study civil society elites in Europe. So what we have done, and when I say we, it's been a group of scholars, kind of 10, 15 scholars, as I mentioned before, from sociology, political science, and social work. So we've been doing studies in 4 European countries: Italy, Poland, Sweden, and the UK, and also in Brussels, so the EU level. So the idea here has been to have, so to say, the widest variation of countries, and of course the widest variation when it comes to how civil society is being organized. And we've done this by investigating 4 core themes in elite research: composition, reproduction, integration, and contestation. We're kind of trying to integrate the knowledge that's been produced in elite research and use the theories and the methods and kind of the understandings of power concentration, which have been so central in elite research, and address that in connection to how is civil society organized, who are leading the major organizations, and how are, so to say, people accessing these key posts and positions in major civil society organizations. So the composition, of course, refers to the people, the leaders, their social backgrounds, their educational backgrounds, ethnicity and gender. I mean, all the classic sociological, social background factors, which are, of course, important to understand and map and investigate to get an image and understanding of what are, so to say, the structures that allow certain groups to access the most prestigious and powerful positions in civil society. Reproduction, of course, points to how are leaders reproduced. Are they looking the same, or are they similar as their predecessors? And what are then the factors that point to the reproduction of elites, or the structures that allow certain groups to, so to say, enter into these positions? Integration of elites, of course, picks up another theme that's classic in elite research, like these revolving doors. For those of you who have been doing studies in Brussels, that's quite common. You can meet the people working for the Commission 1 year, and then the year after, they are leading one of the most influential civil society organizations in the Brussels scene. That's, of course, not only the Brussels experience. You find it similar in many other European countries, the close connections between political parties, positions in political power and decision-making, and of course also the key representative posts and positions in civil society, pointing to this, so to say, that there is a particular type of integration that shapes this group of civil society. However, of course, it's important also to capture the conflicts, the contestations between different types of civil society groups, different types of civil society organizations, and the battle of ideas or ideological positions that might inform as well in terms of who is actually accessing these leadership roles in major organizations and movements, pointing to this, that it's important also to investigate the contestation and the challengers of elite positions. So what we've done is addressing these 4 themes of investigation in these 4 countries and at the EU level, and conducted quite extensive empirical analysis. And I will only mention a few of them. So we built what we call civil society elite scores. We spent loads of time in identifying which actually are the most powerful organizations in each of these four contexts and at the EU level, collecting loads of organizational statistical data, as well as public records and other forms of statistical resources. And I could talk much more about that if you want to. We've also conducted what we call 5 comparative surveys with those who are the top elected, the presidents, the chairs of these, the major organizations, as well as those who are the top directors. Sometimes they're called secretary generals, sometimes they are called CEOs, depending on the context. We have also conducted in the Bourdieusian, inspired by the Bourdieusian understandings of how elites are formed, the prosopographic studies of elites, conducting what we call short biographical studies. So who are leading these top organizations and what are, so to say, their backgrounds, what have they worked with before, kind of key career characteristics and similar. Loads of interviews, document analysis, and observations. Our intention was, of course, to be much more in the field. Unfortunately, there was the pandemic, as we of course know of, which hampered the field activities, because we really wanted to be in the field, making observations of meetings with key civil society leaders, meeting the political leaders, and of course also business leaders of various extent. This is the some of the indicators we used to identify the top organizations. We used indicators addressing organizational resources, so to say those they are in control of, if we use that term, and also organizational resources which are much more depending on external factors. And we use these to construct this notion of elite scores, as I mentioned before, which led us to see which are the most powerful organizations in these 4 different contexts, and how they also stratify along different types of resources. Based on these elite scores, we send out surveys to leaders. And as I mentioned before, leaders like directors or chairs or the presidents. It was difficult, of course, to get them to answer, and especially because there was a pandemic going on at the same time. But nonetheless, we get a fairly good response rate in all these contexts. And what's interesting, of course, here is that they are a little bit like other elite groups in society, perhaps not so surprisingly. If you lead a major organization, like in some context, Greenpeace, in the UK, it could be a huge service provider, having thousands and thousands of volunteers and thousands of people being employed. And of course, the public status that comes with leading such an organization, it might, of course, be quite a demand and also a requirement that you should have, so to say, high education. But you find the same pattern in all these contexts. So irrespective if we investigate civil society elites in Poland, Italy, Sweden, or the UK, they tend to be highly educated, all of them. And they also tend to be, of course, like most elite groups, a little bit more male biased, Sweden with the exception here. They tend to be a little bit towards the end of their careers, which is an interesting observation, of course. So is this something you do after being a successful career in politics or business? So you take up the classic charity position towards the end of your career? Or is it actually so that this is part of a long career when you work yourself up in major civil society organizations in each of these respective contexts? We also find that the leaders tend to be very white, if we use that term. It's very high ethnic and racial homogeneity when it comes to those who are leading the major organizations. And what's really interesting, of course, is also the combination of social characteristics and the values that they hold. So even though their social background characteristics perhaps portray them as similar, to political or business elites, they have very, let's call that progressive values. So we ask them the classic values questions, and they tend to be much more left-leaning or progressive than the population in general. And that is, of course, a critique in a way, or could see in contrast to classic elite theory, where elites are usually seen as, let's say, protecting their privilege and protecting their status positions, and not demanding social change with these value preferences as you. So, privileged backgrounds, it appears, but with these counter-elite ethos that seems to be, so to say, a defining element of civil society elites in all of these four contexts, but also in the Brussels level. Here are some figures, and due to time, I will not spend so much time with the details, but we could come back to that in the discussion afterwards. But I think there are some fascinating figures that should be mentioned here. If you look at the, of course, we can see a variety when it comes to the gender composition, the age. The level of education is, of course, high in all contexts and extremely high in some contexts, like in Poland. Many of them are having this as their main income in a way. So irrespective if you have a director role or a share role, you are, so to say, paid by the activities that you are doing. The years in the organization is one of my most favorite numbers here. People spend loads of time in the same organization until they reach this position, the top position. Especially in countries like Sweden and Italy, it's up to 2 decades in the same organization until you end up as a director and or a president. The income figures, of course, also interesting. I gave a presentation in the UK, I think it was last autumn, and they highly contested these the average income among the UK leaders. It was too high, they thought. That's the numbers these leaders have provided us in these surveys, and there's also other reports pointing to the same high income levels. It's interesting, of course, this self-image of a sector and leaders of so to say, thinking of themselves as being volunteers, at the same time having quite high levels of income in their respective contexts. Taking us to the theme of reproduction. So reproduction in terms of how leaders are both accessing these key roles, but also in an elite sociological sense of it. How are they practicing their eliteness, and how are they also protecting their positions? So very briefly, we can say that in all of these contexts, of course, education matters, the classic elite sociological understanding of it. In some contexts, it's also that you are consecrated by other elite groups, or perhaps even by the state or the crown. In the UK, most of them have royal honors as well in illustration. In Poland, they have presidential medals. And in Italy, they also come with quite high extent of presidential medals. So there is, of course, the element of meritocracy here. But in interviews, the leaders we talk with are very careful in balancing, so to say, these elite credentials, either from top universities or that they have received a medal or a prize from a key elite group in society. And they highly emphasize, so to say, the passion for the cause they have. If you remember the number of years in the same organization I mentioned before, that illustrates one of our key findings, I think, the long internal roots that's dominating in some of these, both the organizations, but also in the country context. The meaning that you spend long time, but you also climb the internal ladders. So you climb the internal organization structures to start to lead these organizations, which of course causes quite heavy closure to access top roles, unless you have spent the 2 decades in the same organization. There are some country differences here. Sweden, Italy, the most, so to say, the internal route is dominating, and the UK a little bit more professionalized, which of course also allows this cross mobility, either between sectors or between organizations. So leaders in the UK much more, let's call it both navigating a more professionalized sector, but also playing a different game, if we use that term, in terms of how they perform passion for a cause. It's not embodied to the same extent like in Italy and Sweden, where they've been socialized into the same organization for years and years. But in the UK, it's much more that they can shift between courses depending on the organization they are currently leading. We also did studies about how organizations legitimize leaders. So what they are emphasizing as the key elements to say that this leader is now, or this individual, is now leading our organization, and we believe in him because of the following criteria. So we did that in a wide variety of organizations in all these different contexts. It's quite interesting that irrespective of, so to say, organizational differences, top organizations, so the major organizations in each context, tend to legitimize their leaders in a similar fashion. They emphasize the charismatic qualities of their leaders. So irrespective if it's a service providing organization or an advocacy oriented organization, it's important for these organizations to kind of image the new leader as a really charismatic person who could take the organization to the next level. And of course, this is a way of communicating the leader as being more or less on par as other leaders of political organizations or business organizations. So the status matching that seems to be at play here. Interviews with top leaders, of course, also illustrate the practices that they are doing to protect their position. They, of course, seeing these the trajectories into a civil society elite role as something that they've achieved through a long service in a way, but they're also kind of carefully navigating and monitoring who is also trying to access the same positions. So we use these terms of closure and cloning to illustrate the practices that are being played between those who are leading the major organizations and their contenders. And the cloning is, of course, the ambition to pick your successor, and to pick your successor as an image of yourself, causing these reproductive patterns, but also close other people off, depending on wrong type of values, perhaps that they are representing the wrong flank within the organization or movement or scene. And here we find some figures again on kind of educational backgrounds. And here we have the civil society elites in the UK context, where education is, of course, it's so important in the UK context because it provides a particular avenue to any elite position in the UK context, including the major civil society organizations or the major charities. So the leaders of the top organizations have an almost as, or perhaps even compared to some other elite groups, even more privileged educational backgrounds in terms of these being educated at Oxbridge. So if we turn our attention to the third theme, integration. As I mentioned before, it could be the image and the metaphor of a revolving doors, that people are moving between elite positions. So in these surveys and in interviews, we asked leaders about their previous backgrounds, where they worked before, what kind of key representative roles they've had before, if they were ministers, key political advisors, top CEOs of big companies and businesses. And there are some clear country patterns, I would say. So the pattern of elite mobility, moving between sectors at the top, is most prevalent in the UK. So once again, so to say, emphasizing that civil society elites in the UK are part of an elite group, societal elite group, where they mix, change, have the similar educational background, to some extent at least, which allows them to be kind of in top civil society roles, in top civil servant roles, as well as in top business roles. So we find it here in the table here that there is a high degree of both public and private mobility at the top in the UK. It's a little bit less in the other countries, of course, depending on structures. A little bit more the emphasis on public compared to the private. So the kind of institutional affinity in a way, or sector affinity between different sectors, depending on the country context. It appears that if you have the public sector background, it's a two-way street. So you could move in and out of key civil society elite roles, and you can move back to the public sector. That's not the case when it comes to the private sector, the businesses. And of course, it illustrates the pattern that business leaders tend to take up civil society roles towards the end of their career to do good, in a way, to be seen as a good individual, rather than for career purposes. Whereas career purposes could be part of the two-way street when it comes to the public sector mobility. We also find that business elites, they take a pay cut. So if we use the Bourdieu language of capital here, of course, they lose some capital, but they also win some types of capital when they're moving between elite roles. So the business elites, they tend to take a cut when it comes to their economic capital, but they do the gain, they do good capital, if we use that, the symbolic status of leading something which is not for profit. And the political elites, they cherish this mobility because it allows them some extra and additional places for political influence. So if we turn our attention to the last and fourth theme in our investigation, contestation of civil society elites, we've done loads of interviews, network analysis, and especially with a focus on kind of gender politics, and partly due to our case of Poland, but of course also that this is one of the most contested areas currently in Europe where civil society is heavily involved and have had previous high influence when it comes to promoting gender rights in various ways. So we find that there are these kind of challenges, both from the inside and from the outside civil society, and the state plays a particular role here. So in Poland, for instance, the state is mainly, so to say, contesting civil society elites in the major organizations, and usually, or at least previously, on quite ideological grounds. So it was too European, it was too progressive, it was too liberal or left-oriented. However, it's not only in Poland we find it, so to say, the state acting as the challenger to civil society elites. We also find it partly in Italy, but also partly in the UK, where parts of conservative groups have much more started to contest some of the major civil society organizations and their political positions they've taken on some key issues. We also find in the UK quite interesting, so to say, bottom-up mobilization against leaders and the composition of current civil society elite leadership in the UK for being too close, for being too homogeneous in a way, and of course, for being too high educated or even for being too white in that respect. So the combination of both contestation from the state, external, but also contestation from the inside, from various types of campaigns and grassroots mobilizations against civil society and how they look like. So trying to wrap up a big research project and loads of empirical investigations in many different countries. So what are we kind of contributing with here? I think we're contributing in a way with our focus on the concept of civil society elites. So if you look into elite research, there has been so many books and studies and empirical investigations about political elites, business elites, or religious elites. However, very few have actually started to investigate civil society elites, and especially in this comparative fashion as we've carried out here. So that's one of the contributions I would like to think about what we have been doing in this research project. What we also emphasize quite a lot is the combination of thinking of the concept of elite as a position that you are leading a major organization in this Millsian or Michel's understanding of power as leading organizations or the institutional command posts. Whereas we also focused on the contestation of civil society elites, either from the bottom up or from other various types of power elite groups. I think also that we contribute with is, of course, unpacking or problematizing this notion and understanding of civil society as a counter-elite per se, and rather finding, showing, and empirically and theoretically investigating that there are leaders on the top structures which kind of follow the same mechanisms and processes of reproduction and integration like political elites or business elites. So the structure and the hierarchies and the power structures of civil society appears to be following quite similar rules as when it comes to political elites, business elites. That's at least what our findings are pointing to at the moment. Last but not least, I think it also shows the relevance of combining the Michel's and the Mill's understandings of elites when investigating and theorizing on civil society elites. The Michel's logic pointing towards the long internal roots that you need to master your own organization to act as a leader of it. At the same time, Michel's was also pointing to that they are strongly, so to say, controlling the contenders inside a movement or organization. Mill's at the same time was, of course, much more referring to this elites as a power elite, an elite integration, which we also, in our investigations, shows the relevance. And here I think it's a way of concluding this presentation, the paradoxical nature of the concept of civil society elites. That the civil society elites are holding a position and they are also structured in a way that they need to handle both of these aspects of the position. On the one hand side, being able to handle the integration that the position requires them, interacting with political elites or business elites for various reasons. At the same time, of course, also handling the pressure from inside the organization and also the expectation that they are there to represent members, beneficiaries, or various types of citizens. So, thank you very much for listening. So here's an sample of some of our most common and recent publications. I think that's the Civil Society Elites. It's a book just out. We also written one other monograph and a series of articles on this topic. And of course, I would be happy to share more information on the articles and our results if you would like to. And as you understood, I've mentioned and tried to emphasize that there is a we here. So it's been a we in terms of a research group working on these topics for many years, 5, 6 years actually, both senior and junior scholars from all these countries. So it's a collective endeavor to high extent. For those who would like to look into more our results and publications, we have this website, civilsocietyelites.lu.se, where we have a modestly updated website on our key findings. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for coming. I'm happy to address the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Håkan. So I will stop the recording now.